Okay, welcome back again to our final session, which I think is probably one of the most diverse groups that we're having today. And also welcome to our speakers and chair. I hand over.
Thank you very much, Caroline. It's my pleasure to be chairing this final session, and the theme is design and production, methods, influences across places and spaces from the hand press period to today. Our first speaker is Patrick Goossens, who studied history at the universities of Antwerp and Louvain, and he's long been linked with the very famous Plantin Moretus Museum in his hometown, which is Antwerp. He's a founding board member of the Friends of the Museum. He's an independent researcher and has co-authored a book on the Columbian Press and published his findings in a variety of venues, including the Journal of the Printing Historical Society. In addition to all of his work and presentations at conferences, he's currently working on a PhD on innovations of the 19th century printing industry in Belgium. His presentation today is entitled Columbian versus Albion, the Fight of Dragons and Dolphins. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you. I will try and share the screen, which should be this. How do I change it? Okay, right. That places and spaces can be changed by the power of the printing press was very well captured in the words of Hugo when he wrote that the printed book will destroy the building. And this is an image from the film, and they mean the cathedral, of course. It was soon recognized that the invention of printing was a major event that should be commemorated. Johannes Stradanus, in his Nova Reperta in Florence 1590, gives the press a very prominent place. With the commemoration of the printing press, the aura that rested on the places of invention could be perpetuated. Since more than one location coupled the invention of their place to their regional identity, disputes arose that maybe still linger on, maybe between Mainz and Strasbourg, and China has incorporated printing in their Belt and Road thinking. The arguments presented, however, were often based on confusing information. The reason for this confusion arises often with what is meant by printing, the technical description. Is it rubbing by hand or brush like in Korea and China? Is it the use of movable type made out of wood, type, or metal or porcelain? The most important, is a press used or not? In this context, printing was always represented in an artistic way, not at all how it really was. Each and every place that claimed to be printing's birth ground presented their heroes and their tools via mostly completely imaginary images. Romantic scenes in statues, prints and paintings penetrated the places where mostly the bourgeois public dwelled, creating their own reality, their own space. Here are a few of the usurpators. The Dutch Laurens Janszoon Koster in Haarlem on the left, in the middle, Italian Panfilio Castaldi in Veltray, who got his idea from the Orient, allegedly, and Jean Brito from Pipriac, printer in Bruges in 1470. And based on the writings of Jean Desroches of 1777, I could even claim that the birth ground of printing was in Antwerp, my hometown. Which brings us, of course, to Gutenberg, maybe not the inventor of, but definitely the midwife of Western printing by combining already existing techniques which could easily be reproduced. We don't know for a fact what Gutenberg or his press really looked like. We always see a very big man and a very small press invading public and private places via statues on market squares, bourgeois mantelpieces, and clocks creating their own space. And for the sake of balance, I should also show an image of Pi Cheng from China, who is naturally not presented with a press, but with a piece of type. These presentations of the press are technically so wrong that they leave us wonder where the artists got their inspiration from. The study of the printing press as a machine itself has a respectable history. Gaskell, Janssens, May, and reconstructing a historical correct wooden printing press was and is a challenge. Images can lead us astray. Karel van der Waarde's new websites are a great new tool for comparing images as well as the presses themselves. Embellishments can be observed, however, in illustrations, and we see that it starts with putting the name of the press in the head on the left, as with Bardius around 1520. The arms of Fust and Schuffer were also used as decoration on the press sides. This is 1548. the Schweizer Chronik, and the 1676 engraving of Abraham von Werth, Nuremberg, shows the press as a fine piece of joinery with a carved griffin on top holding ink balls in its claws. A replica on the right can be seen in the Leipzig Museum. The fact is that not many original wooden presses came to us, let alone decorated ones. This snippet view can be regarded as a little hors d'oeuvre to what came in the 19th century. With the print historian Moran, we should conclude that during the entire phase of the wooden press, it was never really subject of much decoration. What existed in reality and what we must attribute to an artist's imagination is difficult to assess. Modern reproductions throw us off even more, and we can only agree with the former director of the Gutenberg Museum, Frau Hanebuch-Benz, that the big, overly decorated presses to attract tourists are no more than a mixture of historical sources and pure fantasy. Even falsifiers couldn't resist overdoing it, as on the right you can see this 1856 press, which was excavated in Mainz. It had a date and even Gutenberg's initials on it. However, the replica in Mainz keeps living on in its own created space, in which the traditional tourist poses in front of the Gutenberg press and duplicate that image a million times on social media. Not that there's anything wrong with representing a technically historical incorrect machine, if the purpose is to create an intellectual cultural space to commemorate an invention or the spread of learning, as did Johannes Stradanus. And now the dragons and the dolphins, or the representation of freedom, enlightenment, commerce, knowledge, patriotism, or even nationalism in the name-giving of the 19th century presses, or even cast as ornaments on their frame. Charles Stanhope's iron press, the second iron hand press, around 1800, had no decorations at all, except two inscriptions referring to the inventor and the maker. Hansard called it a cast iron lump. Using Latin, he stayed in the wooden press tradition, which could also be an indication on how important the noble lord thought about his invention. It looks as if they are inscriptions on a monument. Later, Stanhope pressmakers, like in Antwerp and further on, used inscriptions or nameplates. The custom of doing this is probably going back to the practice of gold and silversmiths, who often stamped their name, guild, and city in objects to guarantee the quality of the product, down in the corner below right. Stanhope's press became a legend, although in the illustrations about England's great inventors of 1862, he was depicting holding a stereo plate, again in the corner down right. The press likely didn't fit the space of the bourgeois library. But the most iconic embellished iron hand press is definitely the Columbian press. It is almost preposterous. The literature of the history of machine construction in general learns us that the excessive decoration of machines seems to occur only under specific circumstances, when they were made for kings or exhibitions, or when they had to fit in within a certain architectural concept. Iron hand presses seem to stand out. At first glance, the eagle on top of the press, which is actually a counterweight, looks like it is the most typical nationalistic symbol on a press. Its origin would relate to the coat of arms of the United States of America, where it was made. In its claws, the eagle holds the cornucopia or horn of plenty and an olive branch, referring to Greek mythology. In short, the American eagle brings peace and abundance. This patriotic, maybe nationalistic idea was, however, branded earlier in an illustration where a different eagle is shown, grasping in his talons also Jove's thunderbolts and a snake being depicted on the big beam. This refers to American symbolism. Strangely, no press exists with the thunderbolts or snake, which suggests that here too there may be a disparity between the images and the real thing, as we saw with the wooden presses. An alternative explanation comes from Dr. Paul-René Martin in his elaborate La Presse Colombienne from 2004. We should leave the American symbolism behind us, he tells us. The eagle refers clearly to religious feelings, for in the Bible, it is used as the image of Yahweh, the invincible God. Underneath the eagle is a monster, the Leviathan, also called dragon or tortuous serpentine. Hansard calls them alligators and other draconic serpents. They represent evil. Moran, on the contrary, postulates the idea that they are dolphins. His arguments are based on a connection of dolphins with printing ever since Aldus Manutius, who was mentioned in the talk before. Pressmark with anchor was representing speed and stability. He also hints at models of ornaments laying around in the foundry that were used on cannons, or the inspiration he might have got reading old tractates on casting. Alas, Moran doesn't give any sources for that, which is one of the downsides of his great book. Dr. Martin, on the other hand, emphasizes that real dolphins have no scales, and the press dolphins definitely have. The second monster, or dolphin, has a clevis placed in its mouth, connecting it to the big lever. The religious explanation is expanded with Yahweh's arrows of victory and the horns representing power. The second counterweight, the only female thing that's on it, represents hope, being one of the virtues. The staff on the frame of the press reminds us of Mercury or Hermes, recognized symbols of commerce or the bringer of news. The cartouche of fruits and flowers represent abundance, printing makes us rich, and the casted imitations of rivets and bands represent sturdiness, like they were used on wooden constructions. Early on, however, Clymer got into competition with R.W. Cope in London. Clymer came from America to London because he couldn't sell his presses in the States, and he came to in competition with them. Evidence shows, however, that the early Cope presses were not named Albion, but had Cope London cast in their frame. Not recorded anywhere else is two undated Cope presses down in the corner below on the right, being decorated with a bird, maybe even an eagle on top of the frame. Was this for competition? We do not know. Soon, the name Albion was postulated, which carried a lot of historical weight. It was already being used by some printers as their press names. Later on, patent numbers, machine numbers, royal crests, and dates were sometimes added. Decorations and names were subject to change, prompted by fashion, patriotic tradition, or sales pitches, like this Alexandra press, in honor of Princess Alexandra of Denmark, who married the Prince of Wales in 1863. And princesses are very important. Leggett's Queen Press, made by G.R.N.A. Ransom, agricultural machinery manufacturers of Ipswich. He had a shield bearing the royal arms. Top corner on the right is an extra strong press called the Hercules Press, and there was also an even stronger press called Harold's Herculean Albion Press. When new mechanical features were added, the name was improved to Improved Albion Press. The name was extended to Improved Albion Press. Others were not in chronological order. On the left, the Imperial Press, the Britannia Press by Porter from Leeds, and the Atlas Press carrying the world. A Cogger press was also represented in this iconic image, and there is also an ink table. And as you can see, an ink table has no secret powers like a press, and it was thus not embellished. Earlier on in the Q&A, there was talk about the Wharfdale press is also a typical name, but that's a mechanical press. And now I would like to present some information from my ongoing PhD research relating to the introduction of printing technology in 19th century Belgium, which was up till 1830 part of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. The changing of places and spaces in this micro-region is quite exemplary of patriotic outings on printing presses. In 1837, the economist Nathalie Briavoine referred to the English presses imported in Belgium as à la Cooper. Was it referring to Cope or not? We don't know. But it might have left us with a riddle if we didn't know that. Already in 1817 and 18, Belgian Stanhopes were made in Antwerp by Walschot and G.H. Bohul. No decorations was to be seen, but yes, the inscription and later the nameplates. In 1819, George Clymer sent his presses to the continent and Russia to be tested. One came in Brussels, and the Dutch king ordered the 3 royal printers to test it. They made an elaborate report, and one of the remarks was that it could be made much cheaper than Clymer sold them by the national industry. He made them, and Gouy made them, and 4 are still left. Likely he only made 4. On Belgian Columbians, however, a lot of the decoration changed. The eagle became a Dutch crest, or a lamp, or a vase. The crests of the Dutch were painted on the big beam. The Leviathan or dolphin is similar, but on 2 presses, the smaller beam, the Leviathan or the dolphin, was replaced by a torch. A ram's head is added above and on the feet, and I'm not sure what that represents. Hermes' staff is still there, and the feet are luxuriously decorated. And the second counterweight represents La Renommée, the allegorical goddess messenger of Jupiter, which is also to be found on French Columbians. Gouy also made a fake Columbian, which is actually an Albion on the left, and on the right is a Belgian-made imperial press by Van den Brande et Fils in Brussels. which is technically identical to an imperial but looks completely different. The Albion press in Belgium was soon transformed into the Presse Belge, which became quite iconic in our national history. They were mostly made by J.P. Lejeune from Brussels. The lion on top is not the Waterloo lion, but likely based on the Leo Belgicus from an older map. Another version comes with another lion, and there are even versions with 2 lions or other counterweights like the Lamps of Knowledge. The very rare counterweight English Albion, which was only made for a few years, was the model for the Belgian press, and later the Albions changed into a spring head, and in Belgium they were made as well, of course. The relations between place and space is also well illustrated by the events surrounding the Belgian Revolution and consequently its independence. After the separation, Gouy, the maker of the Columbian presses in Belgium or in the Netherlands then, packs up his company and goes up north, continuing to make presses with the Dutch royal crests, as did his successor Hotz. The presses he made before had the wrong Dutch coat of arms on it and needed a makeover. Nothing simpler than just to chop out that crest and a blank space remains. And the old press could remain in its old place, but in its new space, the Kingdom of Belgium. The changing of the maker's names also occur when the press changed ownership via second-hand dealers. And I get to my conclusion. After a while, no-nonsense presses took over, although some decoration was often still added, like the name and the place, to assure the customer he bought a decent machine. The success of Koenig's mechanical press released simultaneously with the iron hand presses and its successors follows a complete different path on the matter of decorations, although up to now they do follow the contemporary design lineouts. Printing in the West thus likely started with undecorated machines. The illustrated literature added embellishment. Commemorators and replica builders never bothered about true representation of the technology, and in the 19th century, the iron hand press was being ornamented. The mechanical press definitely became a no-nonsense machine. Although in the present letterpress community, most printers prefer using undecorated proof presses, in a part of that community, the embellished hand press remains having many aficionados. The fine press movement with figurehead William Morris and his Albion press is no stranger to that. And final, a word very briefly on restoration. It has been common practice for a while, in my view, to over-embellish the cast iron ornamentations with luxurious gold and even very bright colors. I believe this is historically incorrect. They certainly help burning the image of a museum object in the visitor's mind, but it is often placed out of context, even in places where the press never was used as a working tool. Hansard put the idea of bronzing in our heads, but Dr. Martin says that the presses are victims of the barbouillage de plus mauvais goût, of being victims of tasteless smears. Looking at these examples, I also prefer to leave the presses as fresh and French antique dealers call it, dans leur jus. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was detailed and fascinating. We're now going to move on to our second speakers. Luciana Lichewski-Matar is a designer. She holds a BA in design and a master's degree in design theory, both from the University of Sao Paulo. She currently works as a researcher at Innova headquarters, the Innovation Center of USP's Medical School Teaching Hospital. And her background in general is in visual design, product design, theory, and the history of design, along with creative processes and languages. Marcos da Costa Braga is a designer with a PhD in social history. He's currently a professor in the Department of History of Architecture and Aesthetics and a member of Lab Visual's History, Theory, and Design Languages research team, both at USP. He's authored several publications on the history of design in Brazil, including an award-winning book in 2018. Welcome to you both. I'm not sure who's speaking first.
Hello, Fiona. Let me share my screen. So, hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome. It is a great pleasure to be here with you today, presenting mine and Marcos' research. As Fiona Black kindly introduced me, my name is Luciana Matar, and I'm from São Paulo, Brazil, from where I'm speaking right now. I hold a bachelor's and a master's degree in design from the University of São Paulo. Marcos, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, is a designer, a PhD in history, and a professor at the University of São Paulo. Our paths crossing during my undergraduate studies as I was doing my master research, which I will present to you today. We've decided to focus our research on the design of books created by independent publishers during the 2010s in the city of São Paulo. But why did we settle on this particular theme? We had noticed small publishers were rapidly emerging and prospering in a moment when a serious crisis was hitting the editorial market and the printed book market in particular. The self-proclaimed independent publishers making themselves known to the public through printed fairs, which have become some sort of a forum for those working in this sector. It was these fairs that caught our attention and turned our eyes to the graphic productions these publishers were bringing to a market in a deep recession. That's how the research was born. So, our research sought to identify what characterized the products in this niche market in terms of graphic design. And we did so by employing elements of book design and visual design theory. Our specific objective was to identify the similarities and the difference among the selected works in search of a panoramic comprehension on design typologies. This research is of a qualitative nature comprising phases of both exploratory and analytical character, and relied heavily on primary sources and oral history. As it is a very recent phenomenon, there is not enough distance yet for us to be able to rely on other sources. However, examples taken from reference came handy during the phase of object analysis. If we look briefly at the context in which these publishers were born, we can see that the European market has facing a crisis in the last decade. Not to mention what we are experiencing now with the COVID-19 pandemic. Traditional book markets lost readers and revenue. Germany, for example, lost 6.4 million book buyers between 2017 and 2019. If we compare the book market with the annual GDP growth, we can see the discrepancy. While the overall economy experienced a slight growth, the publishing market registered a steady decline. In Brazil, the situation is even more dire. The country's GDP has contracted 4.1%, the worst decline in 30 years, as the result of the economic crisis that has been going on for several years now, and that is marked by political instability and cuts to education, science, and research. With a non-traditional markets of readers, the publishers need to rely heavily on public subsidies. So, we saw the sector shrink 21% between 2006 and 2017. The period was marked by closing of major publishing houses and bookstores, mass layoffs, loss of buyers and revenue, and decrease in editorial production. Anyone who looked at this situation would never have considered venturing in the printed book market. But exceeding even our most optimistic expectations, this is what we have today, or I'm sorry, what we used to have. This is the Plana Art Book Fair. Its 5th edition took place in São Paulo in 2017 and received around 18,000 visitors. The fair was modeled after the New York Art Book Fair by a Brazilian artist. And since its first edition back in 2013, it has shown an exponential growth of both visitors and participants. The print fair is aimed at independent publishers. And Plana was not the only one. The 2010s witnesses a rise of fairs organized and occupied by independent publishers. São Paulo, which along with Rio, is where the country's book selling business has been historically concentrated, hosted a large amount of them. In 2018 alone, we were able to identify 40 fairs, and 12 of them took place in São Paulo. And it was in this particular time and place that the rise of the independent publisher caught our attention. Publishers who placed their bets on printed books in a market that was completely weakened by crisis and layoffs. But after all, who are these people who have grabbed a chunk of the market? Who are the self-proclaimed independent publishers? What unique actions have they taken in order to win over an audience that was losing interest in the printed book? In São Paulo, the publishing houses that call themselves independent are small companies with only a few people and limited resources. Like other cultural activities in the past, they rely on independence as a distinctive label for how they position themselves and how they do things. They claim to be independent for investing both in contents that are diversified and alternative, and in a book design that is unique and standouts in the market. Fairs are the way of displaying and selling the products directly to the public, avoid distributors and booksellers. Their average cover price is low, around $5 to $8. From the production point of view, the organizations are horizontal, almost like small cooperatives. Experimental procedures are encouraged with the adoption of handmade and mixed bookmaking techniques. In the photo, we can see the movable types and the linotype only by Quelônio, a publishing house investigating this research that makes almost exclusive use of typography in the printing of its books. The adoption of manual or mechanical processes, which have long been discarded by major publishing industry, is justified by the small number of printed copies and the reduced number of annual releases. Publishers prefer to make only a few items of unique design rather than many standardized books. In this sense, book design is impacted by company characteristics. So, setting aside the organizations for a moment and moving on finally to the object of the study, what does the design of these publishers' books look like? To answer this question, we visited 4 independent book fairs between 2018 and 2019, and for the purpose of this research, chose 7 publishers to be analyzed. 4 books of remarkable design were chosen from each publisher, and 8 elements that make up the design of these books were analyzed against reference draw from specific literature, in-depth interviews with publishers and designers, and also the critical opinion of the researchers. Since it is a wide-ranging collection, the analysis focuses on the micro characteristics of book design: format, binding, paper, cover, packaging, printing, finishing, and layout. Because of our time limitations today, I brought 3 interesting cases I selected from this range of items, which will give you a glimpse of what these books are like. The first case is a book by Quelônio, the publisher we mentioned earlier that used linotype and typography. At first sight, the publication already aroused suspicions as whether it is in fact a book. And for the publishers and their readers, yes, it is a book. But if we look up the definitions of what a book is, we will find that it could be disqualified by its numbers of pages or lack of stitching. The book has 6 loose pages made with specialty papers stored inside some sort of a cover package with a woodcut print. Because of its structure, it is possible to read in any order. There are no page numbers. Moving on to another example, this copy is a book published by Lote 42 and designed by a renowned Brazilian designer, Gustavo Piqueira. This format of an archival file folder also makes us confused about what this object is. The book tells us the story of a police investigation in which the author got involved. In this sense, the designer chose to bring to life the object in the narrative, so the reader can experience the story. What draws attention is the format, structure, binding, and finishings used in the book's design. True simulacra that break up with the traditional codex. From the same publisher and using the same approach to visible design, we have the book Queria Ter Ficado Mais, which in English means I wish I had stayed longer. The travel narrative is heavily influenced by graphic design, as every story in the work is printed and stored in postal envelopes. In the same way, the choice for format and binding are artifacts in the narrative. It is worth questioning whether the same text would have the same function in terms of narrative if they were printed in the codex structure, with sheets of paper that could be flipped one after the other. In this sense, it is noticeable how the elements chosen for this design become as dominant as the text to the point of altering the experience of reading. From the universe of 28 books analyzed, we were able to observe a diversified landscape of design typologies. There is no uniform language, but we could observe the emphasis and updating of traditional elements that compose the book, especially in terms of formats, structure, binding, and packaging. The materiality of the object was extensively explored to the point of making us question whether certain objects were books. Books that look like letters, archival files, games, maps, zines. At the same time, we observed an investment in early printing techniques, either manual or mixed, which sought to highlight the uniqueness of the handmade. Some copies were numbered by hands, reminding us of engravings. These images show how the dust jacket of one of the books was produced. The book tells us the story of the appearance of a rock in the middle of a peaceful town. The designer opted to print on the book jacket the mark made by the rock. He did it by hands, one by one, in each one of the copies. And this is the result. Kind of a print run of unique copies. This book won an international award for this dust jacket. What we gather from this experience is that the act of reading reaches new levels when the designer chooses to be more than a mere mediator. The designer somehow affects the message by assigning meaning to the text through visual aids, which can be as dominant as the text. The act of reading becomes texture, playful, rhythmic, material. And when we take a broad look at this set of 28 books, we notice that this approach of book design appears in two ways. On one level, the designer transforms content into visual or tactile elements. And on another level, the content is symbolically represented in the design of the book. As we can see here, in the first case, format and binding are iconic to the narrative, while in the second, text alignment is symbolic representation of the story being told. Finally, it is evident that the book designs we found are only possible thanks to the context in which they are placed. Many of the book designs we analyzed were entirely made by one or two people who were in close proximity to the editor, something that facilitates a series of decision-making processes. But in general, we understand that there are certain ruptures in the way book information is handled in publishing. They are nothing new for the fine arts, since they remind us of artists' books. But they are innovative with a commercial framework in which there are functional constraints and limitations, especially when we remember that there is a reader, a user. There must be a balance between the technical and the semantic aspects. So that's all we have time. If you wish to receive more information about this research, feel free to contact us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Luciana. That was fascinating. I look forward to the questions at the end of our session, and we're going to move on straight away now to our final presenter of the conference. It's my pleasure to introduce James Asher. He has served as assistant professor in the libraries and in English at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he catalogued rare books, taught book history, and directed a Scriptalab colloquium, as well as lecture series. His published work includes bibliographical methods, typography, and various related items, as well as methods for training and recruiting librarians. Like our first speaker today, he's also, in addition to all of this work, he's a doctoral student in English literature at the University of Virginia and is finishing a dissertation on bibliography and restoration to 18th century English literature. His presentation today is the influence of desktop publishing on office spaces from SGML to Airspace. So Patrick, your turn now. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that welcome. Can someone tell me if they can hear me? And let me make sure I can get this video shared.
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. And
yes, we see that.
Do you see one title or two titles?
I see
two slides.
I'd see two slides, the first and the next.
Let me try the other way. Apologies. Okay. Now, do you see one slide?
I don't see any slide just now.
Okay, hold on. Screen share, share desktop 1. There we go. Optimize for video clip. Optimized. Play. Now you see one slide.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to Ines and Carolyn for the organization. This has been a fabulous conference, and I'm really glad to be among you. I think this is like a really jazzy panel, and I'm delighted to be part of it. In part because I typically do work in the 17th century these days, but I've always been very interested in computers. In particular, I'm a bibliographer. So I study the history of text, but also the history of printing. And I'm really jazzed about this presentation for you in particular, because I think about computer text like Matt Kirschenbaum has invited us to, as material things, texts which we like to pretend are immaterial, but are in fact on hard drives, on screens, in pixels, physically present. And so when I think about something like SGML, or I think about standards for computer texts, I like to think about them like printer's manuals. This is part of the reason I'm not presenting this sort of thing in a more abstract DHE way, because I'm working on asking questions about how digital kind of standards can be considered printer's manuals and how that can reflect the culture and aesthetics of the time, and be more or less reliable. But today we're going to start with this concept of airspace, a concept introduced in 2016 by Kyle Chayaka. He argues that airspace is this way of describing a sort of interior design motif, which is common to Airbnb in startups. You probably know what it looks like: bricks, Eames furniture, lights, but let me remind you. Here are 4 different cafes. I want you to observe there's wood, exposed lighting, kind of somewhat reclaimed industrial space. There's a bar, but people are working at the bar. It's like a bar for coffee. There are point lights, brick, there's concrete. And where are these, right? These look like they could be all in the same neighborhood. And in fact, they're not. They're on 3 separate continents. In celebration of the incredible diversity of this panel, I've tried to find ones that everyone could go wander to after we're done here. So same cafe, but 3 different continents. Why are they the same? And this is what Chayaka's analysis is about. He argues it's essentially a social and economic phenomena. Tracing Foursquare and Airbnb, people are incentivized to make their space look like other successful spaces. And so you have this kind of looking each other phenomena within Airbnb, where if I want to rent out my bedroom, I make it look like the other bedrooms that are rented out, and everyone kind of coalesces on the same look. And this filters through Airbnb. This filters through Foursquare, it filters through startup companies, all of which kind of live in the same world. The apotheosis is probably a WeWork, which you, I'm sure, have read about, which is almost this kind of sameness, but abstracted to a business model, which provided the sameness. And his term for this is sameness as a service. And this is kind of a pun on, computer stuff like Twitter as a service or messaging as a service. You have the same space as a service so that you can get to work. And that's surely true, right? It's social. But I think that this doesn't look to printers' manuals. If we imagine these physical spaces and the documents around it as influenced by printers' manuals, then sure, it's the social relationships of the people who wrote the manual to the people reading the manual, which is doing this, but we're leaving out this important part, the historiography, the actual objects in text that we can look back on and understand this moment. So I tend to think about this with a couple different terms. Ian Bogost uses this one called platform in his really cool study of the Atari 2600 video game system. He looks at the video game Adventure, which is intended to be a cave explorer that occurs on your screen. And because there's not enough memory and they can't make it scroll, it just turns out that if you go up off the top of the screen, you go to the next one. If you go off the bottom, you go to the next one. And they invented this because of the limitations of the platform, but then this becomes the paradigm, which is overhead video gaming. And so his idea of platform are these technological constraints in which software run that define what we can and can't do. Alexander Galloway has a similar concept. He calls it protocol, the rules of the game. He's more interested in discipline and resistance to the discipline. And he cites things like TCP/IP, the technology by which I come to you today over the network, which is invisible to us, but has rules and systems within it that decide what can and can't be done and affect those things. And he begins to kind of analyze what these systems of discipline do and don't do within society. Matthew Kirschenbaum, already mentioned, calls this sort of thing formal materiality, as opposed to a forensic materiality. Forensic materiality being the thing that exists, our hard drive, paper, ink. Formal materiality being the imaginary things that we pretend are there, files, directories. And lastly, Cindy Wall, a professor here who I admire a great deal, calls these grammars. These are systems of approach. And she links the idea that actually Smith's printing manual defines a grammar for writing and a grammar for printing, which is reflected in the grammars for approaching houses and approaching physical spaces. And so when I'm talking about printers' manuals, I'm thinking about recovering this platform, protocol, grammar, forensic materiality on that one sense, but I think printer's manual probably makes sense to you all. So what Chayaka is talking about, the social world of this thing, lives in basically in something called React.js, or a similar system. React.js is kind of the culmination of this. And what is the grammar? Well, anyone who's played with HTML will have a vague sense of what they're seeing on the screen. There are these tags and they indicate the kind of information and like things can be typed in there. There's some text with tags indicating various things. And the part I want you to see in this, which is a actually minimal React.js program, is this H1 tag highlighted with the arrows in this React DOM on the bottom. The H1 tag is for a heading. It tells us that the thing in here is going to be a heading, however that should be represented on your system. And this bottom part is a little bit of code, which says, okay, go ahead and put this like hello world into that heading. It's important to notice this because we're kind of like, this is present day technology. And this DOM stands for something really important, the document object model, which is a kind of formalized system used in web design for laying out pages that can stretch to be on your phone or be on a big screen or be on a presentation or not. And so it's this very kind of rigorously documented standard that explains how to do this sort of thing. And web designers continue to use this, including the people who work with Airbnb, Foursquare, and run startups. But I don't think the central concept here, that of having containers where you insert information, comes from today. I think it's much older. I personally trace it back to this moment, ISO 8879, the standard for SGML published in 1986. This is an incredibly important standard and I think highly overlooked by print historians and digital humanists alike. This document was put together at a time where if you had something you wanted to print it, you would, you have your IBM printer, it would have several different heads, and you would send codes to the printer to tell it which head to use. You'd say, okay, print it in Roman for a bit, now switch to italic. Okay, now switch back to Roman. Now switch to like the bigger head if you have one. Now center this on a line. And so the system we're presented with here is one which indicates which tray a compositor might use. It indicates which system of typography you should follow. It doesn't indicate what kind of content is there. And the problem IBM and friends were running across is that they really want to be able to make these systems work across printers. You know, I have one printer and I want it to be able to print ALEC and whatnot, maybe headings if it can do it. And then I have next year's printer, and it'd be really nice if my documents could be printed on that just as well. And so the SGML proposes this model for a document, which is, as far as I can tell, where it first appears, that a document can be viewed in the abstract as a structure of various types of elements. An author organizes a book into chapters that contain paragraphs, for example, and figures that contain captions. So we're switching from choosing the typography to choosing the kind of content. And this is a moment I think we see this starting to happen. And we define generalized markup as a way to describe a document structure. The fantasy is it'll need to be done only once and will suffice for all future processing. Anyone who's worked with computer systems knows that's a bit of a fantasy. But the second part's really important. It's rigorous, so programs and databases can be used to process the document, right? So this was a total innovation at the time, and it was utterly unobvious if it was going to work. So unobvious, they had to prove it. So what you're looking at on your screen, and I can hold it up in my video too, is what I think of as the first web page. It's a 1980 book. Jones had been printing out his notes for this software development method using an IBM printer, and he was approached by the team putting SGML together to say, hey, you're doing this, can we mark this up with our generalized language and see if it works and just send it to a publisher so that they produce it? And he said, sure, let's do that. He prints the book, it looks fine. This becomes a proof of concept that in fact a generalized markup rather than a specific one can function, and the world proceeds apace. It's worth noting in the book, it has this wonderful colophon describing the history of the moment that produced it. And I also love looking at this book too. I think it deserves a lot more attention because it prefigures a lot of the design problems we see in print-on-demand books and web pages now. The spread I have here, you can see there's a problem with the breaking. We have achieved by adding and the figures up there. The spacing is entirely like mechanical. It's like they actually went out of their way to refuse to modify it by hand, which makes sense if you're proving a concept. And this sort of thing takes off and is available when Tim Berners-Lee is designing HTML, a term which is based on hypertext coined by Ted Nelson. And SGML is available, so he adopts that. It goes into websites, it goes into React, and arrives at our present day. So I think deserves our attention. So the bit I want to focus you on is this bit from the standard itself. This is 621S separator. The thing on the left, so the 5 number is just the rule number on it. The thing on the left is what's called a syntactic variable expression. And what this is saying is an S separator can be a space, it can be an RE, that is a record end, or an RS, a record start, or a separation character. And an SGML character is not considered part of an S, that is one of these separators, if it can be interpreted as some other markup. So sure, it goes into the markup if it can, but the second part's really important because of its unanticipated consequences. If it is considered part of an S, it is ignored. This becomes a very standard thing that we talk about in HTML design is white space doesn't matter. You can have 2 spaces, 5 spaces, 10 spaces, they're just gobbled up. If they're part of a separator, they're gobbled up as one separator as the system parses it. And I think this is the moment that's overlooked by Chayaka in his focus on the social, is this idea of space, that we have these containers we fill and that they can gobble up whatever space is around them as part of their separators. And I think this leads to things like this. An Airbnb in an airplane. So we know what an Airbnb is supposed to be. You're supposed to have a cute desk to work on, a nice place to sleep, some like pins and stuff around, maybe reclaimed industrial look. And so why not stick it in an airplane? Of course we can do that. So we get this model where you can allocate space based on a plan, based on function. So you can draw these kind of abstract models where you're like, here's where this goes, here's where this goes. Now let's fill it in. I'll get the wood furniture to go in this spot. Here's how much space I have to fill. And these things can stretch. In my own life, I experienced this when we were doing renovation of our library, our initial planning used something called a bubble chart, which might be familiar to some of you here. And we even ignored the presence of the building. We looked at the functional library and we drew circles to represent those functions based on their size, and then tried to fit those circles into the building, and then fit activity and humans and tools into those circles. And I think of this as a platform, but also something that was brought about by this SGML standard in particular. So I think I've shown this 1986 standard is necessary for this model of usage of space, where we look at function and we fit the pieces in and space expands to fill it. But the question, I wonder, is it sufficient? Did the creation of this 1986 standard bring this about? And I think it's not. This is an important book by Theodore Home Nelson, a guy who coined the word hypertext and transclusion and a bunch of other things. But I want you to notice, and I think this audience will see it clearly, is, whoa, okay, thanks. The right panel, you can tell this is paste up. He's typed on a typewriter. He has these little images. I've got the green lines to show you that they don't quite align. He's working with a unit of design, which is the page. He's inventing the page number, and he's doing this work into the 80s. And so I think what this shows us is that while the SGML standard defined an abstraction of space, which was necessary to how we think of airspace, this concept, which is not mine, but I'm interested in, it wasn't sufficient to bring that about. Something else seems to have brought that out, perhaps the social. So to summarize, there are really two things I want you to take away from here. First, I think SGML can be thought of as a printer's manual. In the first place, it influences not just office documents and what we do with them, but the allocation of space. The allocation of space within startups and in people using that software. It also helps us think about the role of space and function in terms of typography. But I think this also turns our use of printers manuals on its head. I think back to Moxon. And when I look at Moxon and I think about his influence on space and design at the time, and I ask, how accurate is this? How useful is this? And I think by looking at something in our recent history, SGML as a printer's manual, and seeing it as necessary but not sufficient to bring this about, we can see the same sort of thing with earlier printer's manual, that they imbibe the architectural and aesthetics of the time, right? They fit into that culture, but they aren't in themselves sufficient to drive change, which if you think about it is obvious enough in retrospect. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have now had three differing in intellectual content and period, etc., all fascinating presentations. And so please go ahead and type any questions in the Q&A. And in the interim, I already have some questions from some other panelists. So from today. So I'm going to start with a question for Patrick. And this comes from another panelist. Eagles and dolphins were rather common, originating from the Venetian tradition where printers and publishers have used these symbols as signets. Is it possible this tradition was also transferred to making the press as a machine?
Yes, I think every proposition is good, because actually we really don't know. But we have to take into consideration that Clymer made this eagle press, as it was called also by printers in the era, in the United States. And he didn't sell, he couldn't get them sold. They were too heavy, they were maybe too expensive. So he came to London, where the eagle is maybe even more known than it was in America, because I know that the eagle was used as a symbol on the press, but the bald eagle is actually not. Well, I don't know why they chose them, but there was not every American was okay with using that eagle, because there was only one. And in France, on the Colombians they made there, they didn't want the eagle at that time. Probably it remembered too much of Napoleon. So it's an overloaded symbol. So it could be anything and nothing.
Okay, thank you for that. And I now realize actually that question was from Ines. And so that's where the question came from. I believe, Luciana, you've already had to leave us. If you're still with us, can you unmute, since I do have a question from Ines for you as well. Okay, Ines has, Luciana, sorry, has had to leave for another appointment. So I will ensure that we forward questions for her by email. I have a question for James. James, you're looking at the standards, the ISO and related standards for SGML, comparing it to Moxon and presumably other printers' manuals. How do you think that people using the standards for SGML themselves conceptualize those standards? And has your research, in order to answer that, has your research included interviews with these modern printers who use those standards to find out if your conceptualization actually matches what goes on in their brains too?
That's a great question. Thank you. I've spoken with a couple. I've spoke with I'm blanking on her name right now. One of the members of the SGML committee who went on to work with IBM and do document design. It's hard because the basic paradigm of the angle brackets surrounding text is as common as air and water now within computers, right? A Word document is fundamentally XML, which is fundamentally HTML driving the cart in front of SGML. And so it's actually really difficult to find a coherent group of people to interview because almost anyone who uses it is coherent. So I talked with some of the SGML folks. I spent a lot of time reading code in open source projects. You can look at contributions on GitHub and see how people are, this makes sense to you, interacting with it. But there's not the self-consciousness that I think this group brings to it, which is why I wanted to talk to you all about it, right? There's a sense that it's inevitable we divide documents like this rather than it is a particular approach.
Sure. Yes, thank you very much. So I'm just looking in the Q&A.
I have one for Patrick, if I may.
Oh yes, please go ahead.
Because I love this panel. Patrick, I really enjoyed your presentation, and it probably won't surprise you. I'm very interested in like the relationship between design in typography and space. And so I was looking at, as you're outlining how these printing presses are decorated, the question I kept wondering about is this decoration style one which is applied to furniture typically, or one which is applied to industrial machinery typically? I was reflecting on your slide with the ink table, right? Where the ink table is not decorated, but the press is. And I'm like, does that make the press like a nice piece of furniture and the ink table's machinery? Or are we decorating machinery now? Or is that the wrong way to think about it?
Well, that is really the big question. I looked a little bit at general literature on machine decorations. There are a few old German handbooks on it, and like I said, they only preserve it for if the machine has to fit into some architectural concept, like a neo-Gothical building with a factory completely set out like that, or if like a lathe was made to be put on an exhibition, a trade show, or was made for a king or for something special. Or even earlier on in the 18th and 17th centuries, machines were always nicely made. But the printing presses do stand out enormously with all the ornamentation. And I can't really imagine what's the purpose of it. Even contemporary literature and writers are often astonished by when they enter a print shop, there's this story that there's like a whole row of Columbian presses with the eagles going up and down. And there is no, I never found a real good explanation why it was so exuberantly done, except that making cast iron so ornamented is actually quite easy. You just have to have a wooden pattern that you put in the sand before you cast it, and then you've got it all ornamented.
Have you looked at objects, cast iron objects around the same time? Like, I guess that's what I'm wondering about, is are these presses normal, or are they somehow deviant for their milieu?
Most of them are decorated like that. There are some non-decorated, but mostly through the whole 19th century, the iron hand presses are indeed very ornamented. The Stanhope stands out being originally a very plump one, but I had in a longer presentation, I would have shown Stanhopes that were made in Holland and in France that had also added a little embellishment to them. So it must have been some pleasure of joy that it was put on there, because it has absolutely no functional use. And if you look at more mechanical presses, like the one invented by Koenig Bauer in the beginning of the same century, around the beginning of the 19th century, they are not as decorated. They don't have all these horns and bells everywhere. They're just functional machines. But then a new trade was made, was the machine printer. You had the printer who worked on the hand press, and then you had the machine minder. So you didn't need a nice machine. All kinds of sociological and historical explanations can be given for that, I think.
That's tremendous. Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you for that good question from James. Due to time constraints, we have now used up the time available to us, so I'm going to draw this particular session to a close and hand back to, I think, Caroline. Thank you very much for all of your rich presentations today.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, first of all, to all our speakers for sharing their expertise today. It's always a privilege to be in the audience at such events and be the recipient of such specialist knowledge. So thank you. Thank you also for compressing your talks into 15 minutes. This was always devised as a two-day event, but circumstances have meant we had to put it together to a single day. The problem with conferences is that all this wisdom is transitory and it vanishes with the conclusion of the conference. So rather than letting all this knowledge go, our plan is to publish a selection of the papers in an edited volume. All I can say at this stage is watch this space, and we'll keep everybody informed of the plans. Finally, I would like to thank Ines for her skills in organising this event, because so much of this has been on her shoulders. And it's just been an absolute delight to work with, and I'm very pleased that you invited Centre for Culture to be a partner on the event. I'd also like to give a big thank you to Ziga, who's for so calmly and efficiently taking control of the technicalities of the event. That was a great relief. And finally, thank you to the National and University Library for hosting the conference, albeit virtually rather than physically as we had originally hoped. Excuse me. The images of the library shown during the breaks are tantalising, and it's certainly our intention, once the world allows us to return to Ljubljana, and who knows, perhaps it'll be for the launch of the book. I'll hand you back to Ines now.
Thank you very much, Caroline. It's been also our pleasure to host this conference. Yes, we were, our history goes back to Persida Lazarevic and the conference she organized in Pescara 2 years ago. And since then we were talking about the organization of this conference, and I guess we really made excellent job. Thank you, Caroline, again. Thank you all presenters for being with us, for presenting excellent themes. And I also think that if we really publish it in a book, it's going to be beautiful. Just one more thing, we have been recording the sessions, and the videos will be available in probably a week or so. And everybody will be also will be notified when the videos will be available. That's all for now. Thank you really much. It was a real pleasure. So I hope you all stay safe and healthy, especially healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, the world.
Bye-bye.